Whenever people talk about the greatest practical effects and filmmaking breakthroughs in cinema history, it's impossible to leave Star Wars out of the conversation. In fact, doing so would be a huge injustice to the franchise. With every new film, Star Wars pushed the boundaries of what audiences thought was possible, and Return of the Jedi is one of the best examples of that creativity. From towering Imperial machines and gigantic space stations to lifelike creatures and spectacular miniature work. So, in this video, let's go behind the scenes and discover how the filmmakers brought some of Return of the Jedi's most unforgettable moments to life. Let's begin with the AT-ST Walkers, the towering two-legged Imperial combat machines seen battling the Rebels and Ewoks throughout the forests of Endor. On screen, these walkers look incredibly massive, heavy, and intimidating, but the filmmaking techniques used to create them were just as impressive. To bring these machines to life, George Lucas visual effects company, Industrial Light and Magic, combined miniature models, stop-motion animation, and live-action compositing in a way that completely amazed audiences in 1983. Yet, the AT-ST seen in the movie weren't giant robots at all. They were highly detailed miniature models, standing only about 1 to 1.5 feet tall. Each model was built around a durable metal armature that allowed the legs, neck, and body to be carefully repositioned one frame at a time. Legendary animator Phil Tippett and his team then animated the walkers using stop-motion techniques, while also incorporating ILM's groundbreaking Go-Motion process, which added realistic motion blur and made the machines appear far more natural than traditional stop-motion animation. Even the forests surrounding the walkers weren't real. Whenever the AT-STs are shown marching between enormous trees, being crushed by the Ewoks' giant log traps, or exploding during battle, they were actually moving through miniature forest sets. Using photographs and reference from California's towering redwood forests, ILM recreated Endor as a highly detailed miniature landscape inside the studio. Every tree, rock, and piece of terrain was carefully scaled to match the walkers, creating the illusion of a vast alien forest. Now let's talk about the Death Star 2, the enormous partially complete battle station that serves as Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine's headquarters in Return of the Jedi. Since Luke Skywalker had already destroyed the original Death Star in A New Hope, the filmmakers wanted its successor to feel even larger, more dangerous, and far more intimidating. On screen, its endless network of steel beams, exposed wiring, and unfinished construction creates the impression of a colossal city floating through space. In reality, however, the Death Star 2 was an incredibly detailed miniature model built inside ILM's studio. The main model measured roughly 4 feet in diameter and was constructed around a sturdy metal framework, but creating its unfinished appearance proved to be the biggest challenge. Model maker Richard Miller and his team spent months covering the exposed interior, with thousands of tiny plastic components, thin wires, brass-etched parts, and kit-bashed model pieces. Every section was assembled by hand, layer by layer, until the inside looked like an endless maze of futuristic machinery. Viewed up close, it resembled a giant computer motherboard, packed with integral mechanical detail. Building the miniature was only half the job. The next challenge was making the audience feel as though the camera was flying across and through this enormous space station. To achieve that illusion, ILM turned to its revolutionary motion-controlled camera system. Instead of moving the miniature itself, the model remained perfectly still, while a computer-controlled camera traveled along a precisely programmed path over its surface and through its unfinished interior. Because every camera movement could be repeated with absolute precision, multiple lighting passes and visual effects elements could later be combined into a single seamless shot. The result was a breathtaking sense of scale that convinced audiences they were soaring around a gigantic battle station in deep space, even though the entire structure was only a few feet wide. Shortly before the film's climax, Return of the Jedi introduces one of the most beloved species in the entire Star Wars saga, the Ewoks. These small, teddy bear-like creatures live deep within the forests of Endor and eventually help the Rebel Alliance take on the mighty Galactic Empire. But what many fans don't realize is that almost every Ewok seen on screen was actually portrayed by a real actor inside a full-body costume. Interestingly, George Lucas' original vision for Endor was completely different. Early in development, he imagined the planet being inhabited by primitive, reptile-like creatures. However, he later abandoned that concept after realizing that audiences would find it far more memorable if a group of innocent-looking, primitive creatures became the ones capable of defeating the Empire's advanced military forces. That creative decision ultimately gave birth to the Ewoks. Designing them was the responsibility of legendary makeup artist Stuart Freeborn and his team. Every Ewok costume was handcrafted using foam latex, artificial fur, fiberglass components, and specially designed tribal-style clothing. The suits were carefully engineered so the performers could walk, run, and express natural body language without feeling restricted. For close-up shots, several hero masks were even equipped with mechanical facial controls. Their eyelids could blink, eyebrows could move, and their mouths could subtly open and close. Off-camera technicians operated these expressions manually, using hidden cables and mechanical controls, giving the Ewoks an incredible amount of personality. That's why scenes where they curiously examine Luke Skywalker or gently interact with Princess Leia feel surprisingly emotional, despite the characters being entirely costume-based. The film's most famous Ewok was Wicket, played by Warwick Davis. Remarkably, Davis was only 11 years old at the time, making Return of the Jedi his very first Hollywood film. The role was originally intended for another actor, but after a last-minute casting change, Warwick stepped into the costume and delivered such a charming performance that Wicket quickly became one of the most iconic characters in the entire Star Wars universe. In total, more than 80 Ewok costumes were produced for the film, worn by a combination of child performers and short-statured adult actors. Each performer was encouraged to develop unique movements, gestures, and personalities, ensuring that no two Ewoks behaved exactly the same. Instead of feeling like identical background characters, every Ewok appeared to be an individual living creature with its own personality. Back in 1983, long before modern CGI became the standard, filmmakers had another incredible way of creating massive environments that simply didn't exist. The technique was called matte painting. Instead of designing locations on a computer, artists at Industrial Light and Magic hand-painted enormous landscapes using oil paints on large sheets of glass or plexiglass. When those paintings were carefully combined with live-action footage, they created breathtaking locations that looked completely real. In fact, Return of the Jedi contains nearly 45 matte paintings, many of which audiences never realized were paintings at all. One of the best examples appears during the famous Sarlacc pit sequence on Tatooine. While the Sarlacc pit itself and the small platform where Luke begins his attack were practical sets built in Arizona's Yuma Desert, the enormous world surrounding them was largely an illusion. The vast desert stretching toward the horizon, the towering support pylons beneath Jabba's massive sail barge, and much of the surrounding landscape were hand-painted by matte artist Frank Ordaz. Those paintings were seamlessly composited with the live-action footage, making the desert appear far larger than it actually was. Another remarkable example appears when Darth Vader arrives at the Imperial landing platform on Endor. It's one of the film's most impressive establishing shots, giving the impression of an enormous military installation towering above the forest. But on set, only a small section of the platform and the large elevator door actually existed. Everything beyond that, the massive landing deck, towering support pillars, the forest below, and even the gigantic AT-AT walker standing in the distance, was created as hand-painted matte artwork by artists including Frank Ordaz and Chris Evans. Those paintings were then flawlessly blended with the live-action footage, convincing audiences that an enormous set had been constructed at Pinewood Studios when, in reality, most of what they were seeing existed only as paint on glass. These weren't the only matte paintings used throughout the film. From distant landscapes to gigantic Imperial structures, ILM repeatedly relied on this technique to expand sets far beyond their physical size. The craftsmanship was so precise that even today, many viewers watch Return of the Jedi without ever realizing they're looking at paintings instead of real locations. A testament to just how groundbreaking ILM's artists were decades before digital visual effects took over Hollywood. If you've seen Return of the Jedi, there's one character that's almost impossible to forget: Jabba the Hutt, a gigantic, slimy, and intimidating crime lord who looks so unbelievably lifelike that many audiences in 1983 assumed it had been some kind of Hollywood magic. Surprisingly, there was very little CGI available at the time. Instead, Jabba was brought to life using one of the largest and most sophisticated animatronic puppets ever built for a feature film. The creature was designed by legendary makeup and creature creator Stuart Freeborn and his team. Built from foam rubber, latex, fiberglass, a steel framework, hydraulic systems, and countless mechanical cables, the finished puppet weighed nearly 900 kilograms or about 2,000 pounds. But Jabba's appearance wasn't finalized overnight. George Lucas explored several completely different concepts during development. One version looked surprisingly human, another resembled a giant snail, and after numerous redesigns, the team finally settled on the iconic slug-like creature that became one of the most recognizable villains in movie history. The real surprise, however, is hidden inside the puppet itself. Jabba wasn't operated by a single performer. It actually required 3 puppeteers working together inside the creature, plus another technician controlling the facial expressions from outside. The interior of the puppet was incredibly cramped, hot, and dark, often compared to sitting inside a tiny submarine. The 2 main puppeteers, Toby Philpott and David Barclay, spent up to 9 hours a day inside Jabba during filming. Small video monitors allowed them to see what was happening on set, while they coordinated every movement together. Toby Philpott controlled Jabba's left arm, operating actions like grabbing objects, smoking the hookah, eating the frog-like creature, and even striking Bib Fortuna. At the same time, he also manipulated Jabba's tongue, using a separate finger control. David Barclay handled the right arm, and controlled the movement of Jabba's enormous jaw as he spoke. Meanwhile, the creature's massive tail required an entirely separate puppeteer. Mike Edmonds worked inside the lower section of the puppet, manually operating the heavy tail so it would drag and sway naturally across the floor. Standing outside the puppet, John Coppinger remotely controlled Jabba's eyes and facial expressions, using a radio control system allowing the eyelids, eye direction, and subtle facial movements to change throughout each scene. Of course, Jabba wouldn't have looked nearly as convincing without his signature slimy appearance. Before almost every take, the crew coated the puppet with layers of gel and artificial slime to give the creature its wet, greasy texture. Combined with the animatronics, those practical effects made Jabba feel disturbingly alive under the studio lights. One fascinating detail many fans don't know is that Jabba's dialogue was originally performed live on set. While hidden inside the puppet, David Barclay delivered every line in English, so the actors could react naturally during filming. Later, in post-production, those recordings were removed and replaced with Jabba's final Huttese dialogue, and the deep alien voice heard in the finished film. It's another brilliant example of how practical filmmaking solved problems long before digital technology became commonplace. While Jabba the Hutt usually steals the spotlight, there's another unforgettable character that's almost always sitting beside him. His tiny, loud, constantly laughing companion, Salacious B. Crumb. Because of his expressive face and energetic movements, many people assume he was an early CGI character. In reality, he was another entirely practical puppet. The creature was designed by sculptor Tony McVeigh, who originally created him as nothing more than a background alien. But once George Lucas saw the puppet's mischievous appearance and exaggerated personality, he immediately decided that Salacious B. Crumb should become Jabba's personal companion. It turned out to be one of the film's most memorable, creative decisions. The puppet was primarily operated by veteran puppeteer Tim Ross. Hidden beneath the large throne platform inside Jabba's palace, Rose stood below the set with his arm reaching through an opening above him to control the puppet. From that cramped position, he performed nearly every movement by hand, making Salacious constantly twitch, laugh, turn his head, and react to everything happening around Jabba. One of the most unforgettable moments in Return of the Jedi comes when Luke Skywalker is dropped into the dungeon beneath Jabba's palace and is forced to fight the terrifying Rancor. On screen, the creature looks like a towering, unstoppable monster, capable of crushing anything in its path. But the truth behind its creation is far more surprising. George Lucas originally wanted the Rancor to be portrayed by a performer inside a full-size creature suit, much like the classic Godzilla films. A prototype suit was even built and tested. However, once the footage was reviewed, the creature looked stiff, unrealistic, and unintentionally comical. It simply didn't have the massive weight and power Lucas envisioned. That's when visual effects legend Phil Tippett came up with a completely different solution. Instead of relying on a full-size costume, he abandoned the idea altogether and created the Rancor as an 18-inch puppet. The challenge, of course, was convincing audiences that this tiny model was actually a 20-foot-tall monster. To pull off the illusion, Tippett and his team built a highly detailed miniature version of Jabba's dungeon. Working together, 3 puppeteers controlled the Rancor by operating its arms, legs, jaw, and body using hidden rods and internal controls. Every movement was carefully choreographed to make the creature feel powerful and alive. But the real trick came from the cameras. If the puppet had been filmed at normal speed, its movements would have looked quick and toy like. Instead, the team shot the animation using high speed cameras. When that footage was played back at normal speed, every movement became slower and heavier, giving the Rancor the convincing weight and momentum of a gigantic creature. It was a simple technique, but it completely transformed the performance. Luke Skywalker was filmed separately on a full scale dungeon set, where Mark Hamill reacted to an invisible opponent while swinging his lightsaber and triggering the massive gate. Later, using optical printers and compositing techniques, Island combined Hamill's live action performance with the miniature Rancor footage into a single seamless sequence. And that's exactly why, even after more than 4 decades, Return of the Jedi continues to amaze filmmakers and audiences alike. Almost every unforgettable scene was achieved through creativity, craftsmanship, and practical effects, instead of relying on modern CGI. If you enjoy discovering the incredible behind the scenes secrets of this film, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more movie making breakdowns.